I want to share with you a truth that will revolutionize your mind and transform your understanding of success, provision, and divine purpose. There is a shift in the atmosphere, a shift that's going to awaken the sleeping potential within you. It is a shift that challenges the very foundation of how we've been conditioned to view work and prosperity. Too many of us are caught up in the endless cycle of doing and striving. We've been told that if we want something, we need to work for it. Strive for it with all our might. We chase after it like a dog chasing its tail, never quite grasping it, never quite satisfied with what we have. We've been so focused on the external circumstances, trying to make something happen, that we've neglected to understand the deeper divine blueprint that has already been laid out for us. God has a different plan for you, one that doesn't involve you constantly fighting for what you want. He said, don't look for work. It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? God said, don't look for work. It goes against everything society tells us. We are taught that success is measured by the amount of hours you put in, the effort you exert, the blood, sweat, and tears you spill. And while hard work has its place, there's a deeper, more powerful truth we need to grasp. The work isn't what gets you to your destiny. It's your faith. It's your obedience. It's your understanding of God's purpose for your life. God is saying, you don't have to look for work because the work I have for you is already inside of you. We've been running around looking for jobs, looking for opportunities, looking for the next promotion, looking for the next door to open. But the truth is, the opportunity, the door, and the promotion are already built into your purpose. You don't need to go searching for it. It's already inside you. Do you understand that? The work that God has for you isn't in a distant future. It's not somewhere out there waiting for you to catch up to it. It's in your hands right now. Your job is not to look for work. Your job is to look within, to see the gifts and talents that God has already deposited in you, to recognize that everything you need to accomplish your purpose is already available to you. It is up to you to access it. We spend so much time searching for external answers when the internal solution is staring us right in the face. God has equipped you with everything you need. The work He's called you to is not a job you apply for. It's a calling that you answer. It's not about what you can do for the world. It's about what God has already done in you, through you, and for you. We live in a world where we have been taught that the answer to everything is hustle, grind, and toil. If you work hard enough, you'll make it. If you sacrifice enough, you'll find success. But God's word challenges this. It doesn't say work harder. It says rest in me. It doesn't say do more. It says trust me. The problem we face today is not that there isn't enough work to do. The problem is that we've been doing the wrong kind of work. We've been working with our hands when God is calling us to work with our hearts. We've been grinding and struggling when God is calling us to trust Him and follow His plan. When you begin to align your life with the purposes of God, things start to shift. You start to realize that you don't need to chase after opportunities. Opportunities will chase after you. When you stop looking for work, God will open doors you never even thought about. When you stop striving and start trusting, things begin to happen that you never expected. This doesn't mean that you should stop being diligent or responsible. It doesn't mean that you should quit working or stop being productive. It means that you need to shift your perspective. Stop seeking the work that the world defines as success. Instead, seek the work that God has already ordained for you. The work that aligns with your purpose, the work that brings you fulfillment, peace, and joy. Not just a paycheck. God has a purpose for your life that is beyond anything you could ever imagine. And the beauty of it is, you don't have to work for it. You don't have to sweat for it. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to chase it down. You simply have to align your heart with His will and trust that He will open the right doors at the right time. Think about it for a moment. Everything that you are seeking is already within your reach. God has already given you the ability to do the work He's called you to. Your job is to discover it, to walk in it, to trust that it is already yours. This is a life of grace, not a life of striving. We've been told that we have to earn everything, that we have to fight for everything. But when you understand the grace of God, you realize that his favor is not earned by the sweat of your brow. It's given by his mercy. You don't have to work for grace. You don't have to work for blessings. You don't have to work for his approval. It's already been given to you. It's already yours. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, if I don't have to look for work, what am I supposed to do? The answer is simple. Trust God. Trust that he has already provided for you. Trust that he has already equipped you. Trust that he has already opened the door you need to walk through. Your work is not about striving. It's about resting in his provision and following his lead. The moment you stop looking for work and start trusting God with your work is the moment your life begins to change. The stress, the pressure, the anxiety that comes with constantly trying to make something happen will begin to fade away. You'll start to operate in a flow, a peace that passes all understanding, because you will no longer be working for your success. You will be working in his success. You see, the work that God has for you is not about what you can achieve in your own strength. It's about what he wants to accomplish through you. It's about fulfilling his purpose for your life. And when you begin to operate in his purpose, you'll begin to see results that far exceed anything you could have ever imagined. So I'm here to tell you today, don't look for work. Don't look for success. Don't look for validation from the world. Don't chase after opportunities that seem to promise happiness. Instead, look within. Look to God. Trust that he has already given you everything you need to do the work he's called you to do. When you stop looking for work, you open the door for God to move in your life in a way that you've never experienced before. It's time to stop chasing. It's time to start receiving. You don't need to look for work because the work God has for you is already inside of you. Trust him. Step out in faith and watch as he opens doors, moves mountains, and brings about things that you could never have done on your own. So stop looking for work. Look to God. The work he has for you is already in motion, and it's time to walk in it. Instead of tirelessly searching for opportunities, we are called to trust that God has already embedded his purpose and provision within us. Success doesn't come from relentless effort alone, but from aligning with God's purpose for our lives and trusting his timing. The work that God has for us isn't something to chase externally. It's something that resides within. Our focus should be on discovering and nurturing the gifts God has already placed inside us, rather than seeking external validation or opportunities. The work God calls us to isn't about working harder, but about trusting in his grace and provision. We are to rest in God's favor and let his plan unfold instead of exhausting ourselves trying to make things happen on our own. We live in a world that constantly pushes us to strive, to hustle, to achieve, and to work hard in order to attain success. From a young age, we are taught that our value is directly linked to our productivity, that the amount of work we put in will directly translate to the rewards we receive. Society constantly reinforces the idea that success is something we must earn through hard work, determination, and relentless effort. The more hours we put in, the more sacrifices we make, the more chances we have to make it. This ideology has been ingrained in us to the point that we believe the measure of our worth is based on what we can accomplish through our own strength and ability. We push ourselves to the brink of exhaustion, chasing after goals and dreams, with the belief that the harder we work, the closer we come to achieving them. Yet there is a profound truth that we often overlook. God's plan for our lives is not about striving in our own strength, but about trusting in his sovereignty, understanding that his timing and purpose for us are far greater than anything we can achieve on our own. God's plan for our lives transcends our own human striving. While we may think we must work tirelessly to make things happen, God is showing us that our work is not about what we can do for Him, but about what He wants to do through us. In our human efforts, we focus on achieving goals, climbing ladders, and securing positions, often losing sight of the bigger picture, the divine purpose that is already set before us. The Bible is full of examples where God calls individuals to places and purposes they never could have achieved through their own strength. Moses, for instance, was not a man of extraordinary talents or abilities in the eyes of the world. He had a speech impediment. He had a past filled with mistakes, and he even doubted his own ability to lead the people of Israel. Yet, God chose Moses to deliver his people from slavery. God didn't need Moses to have it all figured out. What he needed from Moses was faith and obedience to his plan. God's strength and provision were what led the Israelites through the wilderness, not Moses' own human effort. If Moses had relied solely on his own capabilities, he would never have been able to fulfill God's purpose for him. This same principle applies to our own lives. We often work ourselves into a frenzy, believing that our efforts alone will determine the outcome of our lives. But God doesn't need us to strive and toil in the way we think. What He desires is for us to align with His will, to trust His plan, and to walk in faith. He has already prepared the path ahead of us. All we need to do is follow. The work that God calls us to is not about pushing ourselves to the limit or burning ourselves out. It is about stepping into His rest and trusting that He is working on our behalf. There's a difference between human striving and divine purpose. Striving implies that we are working against resistance, that we are pushing hard to force something to happen. It's exhausting. It's a constant fight to overcome obstacles. But when we step into God's plan, we begin to realize that the work He has for us doesn't require endless striving. Instead, it requires obedience. It requires a willingness to follow His lead and trust that He will provide for us in ways we cannot imagine. God's plan for our lives is not about our own efforts. It is about His divine power working through us to fulfill the purpose He has already set. In the New Testament, Jesus teaches us this principle when He says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." Matthew 11:28. The invitation to rest is an invitation to stop striving in our own strength and to surrender to God's plan for our lives. It's an invitation to recognize that we don't have to fight, struggle, and exhaust ourselves to achieve success. God is calling us to find peace in His provision, to trust that He will lead us to where we need to be, and to rely on His strength, not our own. This idea of divine rest doesn't mean that we stop working altogether. It doesn't mean that we sit idly by and wait for things to happen. Instead, it means that we shift our focus from trying to make things happen in our own power to trusting God with the outcome. It means doing the work God has called us to do, but without the heavy burden of thinking that we are solely responsible for the results. When we step into God's plan, we do our part, but we rest in knowing that He is the one orchestrating everything. We can stop trying to control every situation and start trusting Him to guide us. When we trust in God's plan, we no longer have to measure our success by the world's standards. The world tells us that success is about wealth, status, recognition, and personal achievements. But God's definition of success is different. His success is about fulfilling the purpose He has for us, which often looks very different from what the world values. In God's economy, success isn't measured by what we accumulate or what we achieve. Success is about living in alignment with His will, doing the work He has called us to, and trusting that He will take care of the rest. This perspective changes everything. Instead of striving for external validation and chasing after fleeting rewards, we begin to focus on eternal values. We seek God's approval above all else, knowing that when we do His will, we are fulfilling our purpose in a way that has eternal significance. This shift in mindset takes the pressure off of us. It takes away the burden of constantly trying to prove ourselves and gives us the freedom to rest in God's plan. When we trust God's plan and stop relying solely on our own efforts, we begin to experience true peace. It's a peace that comes from knowing that the weight of the world is not on our shoulders. It's a peace that comes from understanding that God is in control, that He knows the way ahead of us, and that He will provide everything we need. We no longer have to work from a place of fear or desperation, but from a place of faith and trust in God's goodness. The temptation to rely on our own strength is always present. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that we must work harder, push further, and strive more to get where we want to go. But when we learn to rely on God's plan, we begin to realize that the outcome is not up to us. It's up to Him. We do our part, and He does the rest. We walk in faith, and He leads us where we need to go. As we begin to let go of our own striving and trust in God's plan, we experience freedom. Freedom from stress, freedom from worry, freedom from the endless cycle of doing more to prove our worth. When we stop trying to control everything and start trusting God with the outcome, we find peace. And in that peace, we find the clarity and direction we need to do the work God has called us to do. So when God says, don't look for work, He's not telling us to be lazy or inactive. He's telling us to stop relying on our own efforts to determine our future. He's telling us to trust that the work He has for us is already in motion and that He will bring it to pass in His perfect timing. Our job is not to strive endlessly, but to listen, to obey, and to rest in His provision. When we stop looking for work and start looking to God, we begin to align with His perfect plan, and everything else will fall into place. In our fast-paced world, there is a constant push toward external validation and achievement. We are encouraged from a very young age to seek success in the visible and tangible, whether it's through our career, social status, or material possessions. The world tells us that our worth is measured by what others can see and how much we can accumulate. We're taught to look outward for approval, to measure our success by external factors, and to focus on external appearances. This often results in a cycle of comparison, competition, and the constant need to prove ourselves. But in the midst of this, there is a profound truth that many miss. Real success and fulfillment come from a shift away from the external and toward the internal. When we begin to focus on the internal, we stop measuring our worth by what the world sees and start understanding our value in terms of who we are, not just what we do. We shift our attention from striving for external accolades to seeking inner peace, personal growth, and alignment with our true purpose. This transformation begins when we learn to look inward, to examine our hearts, and to align ourselves with the deeper calling that God has placed within us. The external world, with all its distractions and temptations, often leads us to believe that our identity is defined by what we achieve or possess. The pressure to measure up, to keep up with others, or to prove our worth through tangible successes can easily consume us. It creates a sense of urgency, pushing us to act out of fear, insecurity, or a desire for approval. The constant chase for more, whether it's more recognition, more money, more success, often leaves us feeling empty, as if we're running on a treadmill that never stops. We find ourselves constantly reaching for something, yet never truly satisfied or fulfilled. At some point, many people begin to realize that no amount of external success can truly satisfy the deeper longings of the soul. Accomplishments, accolades, and possessions may bring temporary happiness, but they do not provide lasting peace or fulfillment. True contentment comes not from what we gain from the world, but from what we cultivate within. And that's where the shift from external to internal begins. God has created each of us with unique gifts, talents, and purposes that are meant to be discovered and nurtured within ourselves. Our external achievements are important, but they are not the full measure of who we are. The internal transformation, the work that takes place deep inside of us, is where true success lies. When we shift our focus inward, we start to realize that our worth is not dependent on what we accomplish or what others think of us. It is determined by the identity that God has already given us, an identity that is secure in His love and grace. When we begin this shift, the external pressures start to lose their grip on us. We stop comparing ourselves to others because we begin to see that our purpose is unique to us and not dependent on anyone else's journey. The need for external validation fades as we grow more confident in our internal worth and the understanding that we are deeply loved by God, regardless of what the world may say or think about us. One of the first steps in making this shift is to cultivate an inner life of peace and self-awareness. Instead of looking to external circumstances to define our worth, we look inward to what God has already placed inside us. We recognize that our value does not come from our job title, the amount of money we make, or the number of followers we have on social media. Our value comes from the fact that we are created in the image of God, and that is a truth that cannot be shaken by the opinions or achievements of others. This internal shift also brings about a deeper sense of purpose. When we stop focusing on external markers of success and start paying attention to the internal stirring of our hearts, we begin to recognize the unique calling God has placed on our lives. We stop trying to live up to society's standards and begin to live out the calling that is deeply rooted within us. This calling may look different for each person. For some, it may mean pursuing a career that aligns with their passions and values. For others, it may mean dedicating time to serving others, nurturing relationships, or finding creative outlets for expression. Whatever it may be, the internal shift helps us to stop chasing the fleeting and focus on the eternal. It encourages us to build a life based on purpose rather than superficial success. As we focus more on the internal, we also begin to understand that true fulfillment comes from growth, not perfection. The world often pressures us to be perfect, to have everything figured out, and to appear successful at all times. This pressure can lead to stress, burnout, and feelings of inadequacy. But when we focus on internal growth, we shift our perspective from the need to be perfect to the desire to learn and improve. Growth becomes the goal, not perfection. We begin to understand that it is okay to make mistakes, that failure is part of the process, and that the journey itself is where we find purpose and joy. This process of internal transformation also leads to a deeper sense of peace. When we are constantly focused on external accomplishments, we often find ourselves in a state of unrest, always striving for the next goal or the next achievement. There is little room for peace when we are constantly chasing after something external. But when we shift our focus to the internal, we begin to find peace in the present moment. We stop looking for fulfillment in the future or in external circumstances and start to appreciate the present as a gift. We find joy in the small things, in the everyday moments, and in the quiet spaces where God is speaking to us. Another significant aspect of this shift is the understanding that true happiness comes from within. We often look to external things, relationships, achievements, possessions, to bring us happiness. But true happiness is not found in these fleeting things. It comes from an inner sense of contentment that is rooted in our relationship with God and our understanding of our identity in Him. When we look inward, we begin to realize that happiness is not something to be sought externally. It is something that God has already placed within us. It's a joy that transcends circumstances and is anchored in His love and grace. This shift from external to internal also requires us to be more mindful and intentional in our lives. Instead of reacting to the external pressures and demands around us, we begin to live more intentionally, guided by our values, purpose, and relationship with God. We make decisions based on what aligns with our internal sense of purpose, rather than what will earn us approval or recognition from others. We stop living reactively and start living proactively, with a clear sense of direction and purpose. When we make the shift to focus on the internal, we also begin to build deeper, more meaningful relationships. External success often leaves us feeling isolated or disconnected, as we are so focused on achieving and competing that we neglect the relationships that truly matter. But when we focus inward, we are better able to connect with others on a deeper level. We begin to appreciate the value of relationships that are built on authenticity and mutual respect, rather than on superficial achievements or shared interests. Ultimately, this shift allows us to live a more fulfilling and meaningful life. It frees us from the constant pressure to measure up to external standards and allows us to embrace who we truly are. We no longer feel the need to compare ourselves to others or to seek validation from the world. We begin to live in the fullness of who God has created us to be, walking confidently in our purpose, and trusting that the internal work He is doing in us is far more important than anything we can achieve externally. In a world that constantly tells us to look outward for validation and success, the true key to fulfillment lies in shifting our focus inward. By turning our attention to the inner life, the life that is rooted in our identity in God, we begin to experience a deep sense of peace, purpose, and contentment that cannot be shaken by external circumstances. It is in this internal transformation that we find true success, the kind that transcends the temporary and leads to a life of lasting fulfillment. In a world that constantly promotes hustle and grind, the concept of grace can seem counterintuitive, even contradictory. The modern-day mantra, grind until you make it, encourages individuals to push themselves to the limit, work endlessly, and sacrifice everything for success. Hard work is celebrated as the key to achieving dreams, and there is an unspoken belief that the more you push, the greater your rewards will be. However, this relentless pursuit often comes at the expense of our well-being, relationships, and spiritual peace. The endless grind can leave us feeling burnt out, exhausted, and disconnected from the very purpose and joy we initially sought to achieve. But the truth is, there is a different way, a way that centers on grace rather than grind. Rest instead of relentless toil, and trust in God's provision over human effort. Grace is an unearned, undeserved favor. It's God's love, mercy, and kindness bestowed upon us, not because of anything we have done to deserve it, but simply because of who He is. This concept of grace is radical, countercultural, and revolutionary in a world that encourages self-reliance, achievement, and hard work as the ultimate signs of success. Grace operates on a different principle than grind. It is not about our striving or our human effort, but about God's divine provision and His willingness to work in us and through us despite our imperfections. Grace frees us from the constant pressure to perform, achieve, and prove ourselves. It invites us to step back and recognize that we don't have to exhaust ourselves to earn God's favor or to fulfill our purpose in life. The idea of grace over grind is not an excuse to be lazy or to neglect our responsibilities. It is not a call to abandon hard work, but rather to approach work with a different mindset. When we embrace grace over grind, we shift from a place of striving to a place of trusting. We no longer see our efforts as the sole determinant of success, but instead understand that God is the ultimate source of all our provision. This mindset allows us to work with diligence and purpose, but it also invites us to work from a place of rest, peace, and assurance that God is with us, guiding and sustaining us every step of the way. To truly embrace grace over grind, we must first acknowledge that we cannot do it all on our own. The grind mindset often leads us to believe that we must control every aspect of our lives. It tells us that if we just work harder, we will eventually reach the top. But this belief is rooted in a false sense of self-sufficiency. We are not meant to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders. The truth is, we were never meant to live in our own strength alone. The Apostle Paul writes in Philippians 4:13, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." This verse highlights the key difference between grace and grind. While grind relies on our own effort, grace depends on God's strength. It's in surrendering our need to control everything that we find true rest and strength. There is a profound sense of freedom that comes when we stop trying to prove ourselves through our own efforts. When we stop chasing after success based on external validation, we can experience the grace that God offers. This grace invites us to rest in the knowledge that God has already provided for us in every way. We don't have to strive endlessly for success because God has already prepared the way. In Peter 1:03, we are reminded that his divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. This verse is a powerful reminder that we already have everything we need to live the life God has called us to live. It is not about striving to earn God's favor, but about receiving the grace he freely offers. The grind mentality tells us that our worth is determined by our productivity. We are constantly judged by how much we accomplish, how busy we are, and how many goals we can check off our list. But grace offers a different perspective. Grace says that our worth is not determined by what we do, but by who we are in Christ. Our identity is not rooted in our work or achievements, but in the fact that we are beloved children of God. The pressure to perform, to constantly do more, and to measure up is lifted when we embrace the truth that God's love for us is unconditional and not based on our productivity. When we stop trying to prove ourselves through our own effort, we open ourselves to receive the grace of God. We begin to see that God's grace is sufficient for all our needs, both spiritually and practically. It's grace that sustains us when we're weary, grace that gives us strength when we feel weak, and grace that empowers us to do the work God has called us to do. It's grace that enables us to face challenges with courage and to persevere through difficulties with hope. The grind mindset may push us to work harder, but grace empowers us to work smarter with wisdom and in alignment with God's will. Moreover, embracing grace over grind doesn't mean that we stop working altogether. It means that we approach work with a different attitude. Instead of seeing work as a burden or a way to prove our worth, we see it as an opportunity to partner with God in fulfilling his purpose for our lives. Work becomes an act of worship, a way to honor God with our talents and abilities. We work not out of obligation or fear of failure, but out of gratitude for the grace God has already shown us. As we partner with God in our work, we find that he provides the strength and guidance we need to accomplish our tasks without burning out or losing sight of what truly matters. This mindset also changes the way we view success. In the grind culture, success is often equated with money, status, and achievements. But in the economy of grace, success is defined by our faithfulness to God's calling and our ability to trust him in every season. Success is not about how much we can accumulate or how high we can climb on the corporate ladder. It is about living a life that reflects God's love, grace, and truth. It's about being faithful in the small things, finding joy in the process, and trusting that God will bring about his purposes in his perfect timing. There is also a deep peace that comes when we embrace grace over grind. The grind mentality often leads to stress, anxiety, and burnout. as we feel the constant pressure to perform and achieve. But grace brings peace because it allows us to rest in God's provision. It frees us from the need to control every outcome and gives us the confidence that God is in control. Grace allows us to trust that He will provide for us in every situation, even when we don't have all the answers or see the way forward. Instead of worrying about the future or fearing failure, we can rest in the knowledge that God is faithful and He will never leave us or forsake us. When we live by grace over grind, we also become more compassionate toward others. The grind mentality often leads to a competitive me-first mindset where we view others as obstacles to our success. But grace changes our perspective. Grace helps us see others through God's eyes, with love and understanding. When we embrace grace in our own lives, we become more generous, more forgiving, and more patient with others. We understand that just as God has shown us grace, we are called to extend that same grace to those around us. Finally, embracing grace over grind helps us maintain a healthy balance in life. The relentless pursuit of success can lead to neglecting important areas of life, such as family, health, and spiritual growth. But grace teaches us to prioritize what truly matters. It reminds us that life is not just about achieving, but about living in harmony with God's will and enjoying the gifts He has given us. By embracing grace, we find that we can work with purpose and diligence while also taking time to rest, rejuvenate, and nurture the relationships and passions that bring us joy. In a world that constantly pushes us to grind, to hustle, and to achieve at all costs, grace invites us to step back and rest in the assurance that God is with us. It frees us from the pressure to perform and empowers us to live with purpose, peace, and joy. When we choose grace over grind, we find that success is no longer defined by what we do, but by how faithfully we walk with God, trusting that He will provide everything we need for the journey ahead. The grind may push us forward, but grace will carry us through.